So welcome along everyone, this is Eat to Live, how are sustainability and food interlinked, a session as part of Feastival. I hope you're having a really good day at the online festival. My name's Jake Causley and I'm the Sustainability Coordinator for Falmouth University. I've been in post now for just over a year, working with Falmouth to develop its strategy and action plan, and we're in the process of delivering that across three main themes at the university, so learning and teaching, embedding sustainability into our curriculum, environment and operations, where we're looking at campus, can it be more sustainable in the way we operate and run it, and people and behaviour change, which is exactly things like this, where I'm engaging with the public, our team's engaging with the public, our campus community and the local community to help drive sustainable thinking and sustainable behaviour changes. So I'm really excited to be here today. A scope of what Eat to Live is going to be about today. I'm going to hopefully outline the various ways to you in which the food industry poses great challenges surrounding sustainability. But in doing so, I hopefully will empower you with some key considerations and actions that every single one of us can take to improve their sustainability when we consider food. So we're going to explore various problems, various solutions. First, we're going to touch in to the problems. So we're going to cover things like agricultural practices, packaging, welfare and ethics, wastage, and carbon emissions as well. So before we begin on the problems then, what should the planet be like in terms of farming? Well, prior to actual, the green revolution of farming and current farming as we know it, humans were hunter-gatherers. They lived in small numbers, didn't take too much. They ate meat rarely. And the resources they used therefore naturally renewed themselves. It was mainly fruit and vegetables. They didn't take too much, so they lived sustainably. So sustainability is all about using resources in a way that there is enough and plenty for the generations to come. With the advent of farming, though, as we know it today, we changed our lifestyles and changed our planet drastically. So first we're going to hint into today is agricultural practices themselves. How are they problematic when it comes to sustainability? Ultimately, they're destructive, so they alter the land in many ways. By eating meat and dairy in particular, we're demanding huge areas of space for the animals plus the feed needed to be grown to feed them. In particular, I like this graphic by Oatly, which just showcases that almost in a different level. So we have the crop plant to the product in the sort of dairy-free way in this sense. When you add a livestock animal, so in the meat and dairy industries, we're adding a threshold of land that we need and a threshold of resources we need. We're almost doubling up, if anything, more than doubling up the effort and the energy required. So there's almost twice as much agricultural practice that goes into it. This land alteration is really bad in many ways because natural ecosystems and associated high diversity from places like forests, which are usually cleared for agricultural land, these are replaced with low diversity, poor quality environments such as pasture and monocrop fields. They alter things like insect biodiversity because of the plants that are grown either for feed or that exist in the corners of hedgerows, changes the insects that appear. Therefore, that changes the dynamics in that ecosystem. Also, we affect abiotic processes, so things like microclimates. So whereas in a forest you'd have a lot of wind blocking, a lot of soil retention from the roots, that all goes away when we think about monocrop fields and livestock fields. Wind speeds may blow away soils, make soils very infertile, lose that upper layer of really fertile soil. Also, a key consideration is when we talk about global warming and the climate crisis, darker patches of land absorb more heat, whereas things like forests radiate and heat to extent. So when we convert land and alter it into agricultural land, we are increasing the albedo, what it's called, decreasing the albedo, the reflectivity of that surface, absorbing more sunlight and heating our planet further. That happens in places like this intensive cattle farm, for example. But even, crop farming, which is probably this picture, farming in Bolivia, requires huge amounts of land to be altered. There's not much forest remaining there. So to put that in perspective for you, this diagram from WWF's Planet-Based Diets research paper sums it up, really. We are a water-based planet. There's just over 70% ocean, but of that 30% land, and that's 71% that's habitable by humans. 40% of that we use for food production. Which is mad. Over half of the habitable land we have here on Earth is used for food production. It's not even, for conservation for natural areas. It's been converted. And you'll see here in the fourth row down that a vast majority of that is for livestock, for meat and dairy, whether that's the crops to feed them or the land to raise them themselves. So land alteration is a real problem. With land alteration comes degradation as well, which is a decrease in the land's condition. As we farm a patch of land over and over, we're decreasing the quality of soils by doing things like ploughing and adding fertilizers. We're not experiencing natural processes on that piece of land, so the quality of that land decreases. You can see from this image in the Amazon evidence of deforestation, which will be, patches of lighter green for agriculture. That land will never be the same again. It will never have the quality in nutrients and other abiotic principles as it did when it was a forest. This is really important because degraded land interacts with climate change, both individually and in combination. They have profound implications for natural resources. If we want to use that land again in other ways, it may be poorer quality. We also got to think about things like pesticide and herbicides, not natural chemicals that kill a lot of pollinators and other weedy plants that support insects. That's really destructive. We need pollinators. They underpin whole ecosystems. They underpin pollination, which in turn lets the plants grow and multiply, which supports a whole host of other species. Often plants in crop farms are also grown in monocultures, which is bad as well, because the insect diversity is less, because there's less variety in plants for the insects to feed off, and therefore the specialisms aren't necessarily there. So monocultures are bad as well. And on top of all that, the other reason agricultural practices are problematic is because it causes widespread habitat loss. The planet is already in a sixth mass extinction event. This is comparable to a meteor hitting the planet, like it did so, as far as scientists believe, to wipe out the dinosaurs. The population sizes of animals have dropped 68% since 1970. That's 50 years. So we're losing species at a rapid rate, and a lot of that is due to habitat loss from agricultural land. A quote from David Attenborough's latest documentary, we account as humans for 30% of the mass of mammals, a further 60%, so a total of 90%, 60% of the animals we raise to eat, and the rest, from mice to whales, make up 4%. Staggering amount of loss. And that's just on land. We're talking about agricultural practices not only on land, but also in water. So fishing and aquaculture, if you pardon the pun, are a whole other kettle of fish. They're also destructive in more than one way, in practice and also post-practice. So they have effects. We have effects on the ecosystem after we've farmed there. So the ocean itself gets degraded and altered in the process. The key stat here is we're always talking and hearing about the Amazon rainforest being cleared in terms of sizes of football fields. At the moment, the estimation is 27 fields per minute. In the ocean, that's over 4,000 per minute. Let that sink in a second, over 4,000 per minute football fields. This is because the ocean is made up of loads of complex layers. As soon as we impact one layer, we indirectly influence another layer. Removing fish, apex predators like sharks, we adjust those food webs and we disrupt the dynamics, and those ecosystems start to fall apart. There's lots of interactions between different layers in the ocean, from the base sea level, sea floor, to the surface and the mid layers as well. Also, trawling for fish at the bottom churns up the seabed, washing up nutrients that otherwise would have been kept at an all-time low down there. So you get things like these sort of blooms. You can see the sort of style here in Alaska. This is an Alaskan spring bloom, which is natural. But if we churn up the bottom of the seabed, we're at risk of causing more plankton blooms at different times of the year, which is bad because it can demand different nutrients at different times of the year. Species may become asynchronous to when that happens, and their populations may be affected. Very bad. So the other key problem with fishing practices in particular is ghost fishing. So this is where nets are broken off as part of the fishing practices, and they continue to drift in the ocean and catch species. These things are designed to kill, so drifting around the ocean, collecting more and more animals, entangling them and killing them, which leads to habitat species loss, and therefore habitats altering. Fishing isn't as targeted as land-based agriculture, if you like. There's bycatch, like I say, not only from ghost fishing, but also the practice itself. Some crazy stats out there. Over 300,000 whales, dolphins, and porpoises are killed each year as bycatch, and over 50 million sharks, which is really sad. Again, we're in an ecological crisis. A sixth mass extinction is underway. We've lost 30% of our fish stocks. We've overfished them to critical levels. Fish are needed in the sea because they deposit nutrients in lots of different places, allowing them to thrive and control fluxes in populations. And so much so, we've depleted these fish stocks that today 50% of the world's seafood is actually farm-raised, which is pretty crazy to think about. Ultimately, the point here with agricultural practices being problematic is when it comes to sustainability, the earth is finite, whether land or water. We need to use resources sustainably to fundamentally help human well-being and prosperity. Loads of ecosystem services come from the land and water, and we need to respect that. Touch on a few other problems then. Ethics and welfare is often an angle brought into agriculture and food. There's increasing understanding that the animals we farm, like fish, and livestock like cattle and sheep, they're sentient, conscious beings capable of experiencing pain, fear, and loss. So therefore, no method of killing or farming can therefore be humane, really. A lot of people would argue. For example, some young calves and young lambs are taken from their mothers as part of the meat and dairy industries. You can only imagine what an animal like that might feel like. And in terms of fish, a stat here is that 50% of 50% of farmed salmon actually die from egg to plate. So 50% of the salmon that we originally breed to farm actually die, which is really sad. So huge problems with ethics and welfare with food as well. Packaging is another big one. So at the moment, you may have heard of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a massive patch in the Pacific Ocean of just pure garbage. It's 1.6 million square kilometers, which is mad. 46% of this is fishing nets. It's not the straws we've given up. It's not the plastic cutlery we've given up. It's nets. So it's actually from the agricultural industry that a lot of this garbage has come from. Another problem and another side of this is plastic is often used to package fresh produce, not only meat and dairy, but fruit and veg as well. Plastic ultimately is a blessing and a curse. It's very cheap, it's very versatile, but it's long-lasting and harmful in many ways. Also, fundamentally, it's made from fossil fuels, which is a finite resource. It's energy intensive to produce plastic, and this further fuels the climate crisis. More on that in a little bit. And microplastics are giving us another angle of insight that's almost shocking, bigger, and scarier, but also not much is known about it. So microplastics are the tiny sort of fragments that plastics break down to over time. WWF estimate that an average person could be ingesting 5 grams of plastic a week as a result of these, which is the equivalent of a credit card, which is really scary. Microplastics contaminate our air, our foods, especially fish, because it's easier for fish to absorb plastics, and water as well. The long-term effects on our health of microplastic consumption are not clearly understood. This is a real issue. Additives and chemicals are also another side to the problems with agriculture. Packaged goods often have preservatives in. Pesticides and herbicides are used on crops, which may enter our systems from consuming the products. Like I say, remaining on the plant or in the animal meat when they come to our plate. Also, things like hormones are actually injected into some livestock animals, such as dairy cows. So there's actually hormones present in milk, which we could be ingesting, which is terrible for human health. Wastage is also a key consideration. We're very wasteful as a population, and food waste is a real issue. We have more than enough food to feed the people on this planet. We just need to farm efficiently and distribute correctly. But as it stands, around a third of all food produced in the world for human consumption per year gets lost or wasted. In the UK, that's about 7 million tons per year that's thrown away, and most of that will actually be okay. This is bad not only because the environment is being exploited for nothing, for the food to only be thrown away, but the embodied energy in that food is great. We've got the production of it, the packaging of it, the transport. A lot of energy went into that food item, and we can't be wasting that energy. Disposal of food isn't great either. Lots still goes to landfill. Most is anaerobically digested, which is better, but not perfect. But composting is the ideal. For example, here in Cornwall, the council found out that 35% of their black bin bag waste is actually food. So fortunately, they're introducing a food processing anaerobic digestion collection for that. But it's still not great for sustainability. Another key issue is overconsumption. We're overconsuming globally. We're currently using about 1.6 Earth's worth of resources. There's this concept called Earth Overshoot Day, which is the day in the year that humanity's demand for ecological resources and services exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. Last year in 2020, that was August the 22nd, despite lockdowns. So in less than 8 months, we used an Earth's worth of resources. We need to cut resource use, and food is a key area where we must take action. Ultimately, we eat too much. For example, look at this image from WWF's Planet-Based Eating document, where you can see that the current diet on the left-hand side is the USA's per capita grams consumed per day, is almost twice as big as the Indonesian average diet. We can survive on less food, it's just we overeat and overconsume. If we eat less, we'll reduce the impacts from food that we've gone on to talk about. And ultimately, on top of all of this, and directly as a result of everything we talked about, food processors and the food industry is very carbon intensive. And this is a massive issue because we are currently in a climate crisis. 3 of the 15 planetary boundaries we think have been passed. So that is, they've reached a tipping point and passed them. They are beyond saving, beyond regeneration. These are the Arctic and Antarctic ice sheet extents, and also coral bleaching as well. I think about 90% of the coral reefs in the world are experiencing bleaching. This is bad because it shows the climate is still running away. It's still warming excessively, and we need to act on it. Globally, it's estimated that 27% of carbon emissions come from food production. So there's a really good graphic here from WWF as well, showing that how significant this is. Agriculture accounts for so much because of the embodied carbon. Similar to the embodied energy principle, there's lots to a food's production, from changing the land to producing the crops, to producing crops for livestock, farming livestock, packaging, transporting, and selling. It all counts. Also a problem is that agriculture, forestry, and other land use methods are a net source of other greenhouse gases that are more potent than carbon dioxide. So methane and nitrous oxides, for example. Nitrous oxides have 265 times the warming capability than carbon dioxide. So for every molecule of nitrous oxide released, it has 265 times the warming potential, which is bad news for our warming climate. You'll note that most carbon actually comes from livestock and fisheries. This is to rear the animals, but also to provide the feed for the animals. This infographic by Oatly sort of shows the sort of dairy side compared to oat milk, which is staggering, really. Most of the total emissions come from rearing the livestock itself. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates 14.5% of all global emissions come from meat and dairy industries. So meat and dairy in particular are seen to be very carbon intensive. When compared to plant-based alternatives, the emissions are truly massive. For example, you can also think of soya as feed for meat and dairy cattle. Often these are grown in Amazonian countries or the Americas. Here in the UK, we may escape transport emissions from a meat or dairy product if we buy British produce, but there's a big chance these animals have been fed using soya in feed from the Americas. Globally, 90% of soya is used to feed animals. So there are massive carbon implications from industries like meat and dairy. Like I say, there's still effectively transport emissions in your British beef or dairy product because of soya potentially being flown in from the Americas. And don't forget about wastage as well. During 2010 to 2016, the global food loss and waste equaled 8 to 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So wastage needs to be addressed too if we are to tackle the carbon associated with agriculture. On an individual level, that percentage, about 25% of global emissions, is often the same, alongside transport, home, carbon, and purchased goods and services. but it may vary depending on your diet, which we're going to come to. So here's mine, for instance. Mine is between 14 and 23%, depending on the calculator I used. I've been vegan for 2.5 years, so mine is understandably slightly smaller. More on that in a bit. But notice, food still remains a massive portion of my carbon footprint because of all this embodied carbon we're talking about. So why not calculate your personal carbon footprint on Carbon Savvy or WWF footprint website to find out more about that? Ultimately, if we don't act on agriculture and the climate crisis, it will lead to more problems surrounding food production. Some climate change mitigation efforts will require large land areas, such as reforestation. These are projected to compete with existing uses of land, like for food crops and livestock farms. Competition could therefore increase, food prices may rise, and this will lead to further intensification. All those bad things we talked about, fertilizer use, water use, land degradation, will just increase if there's more competition. Therefore, food security can really be affected by future climate change, so we need to act on carbon now. So there's the background for you. Those are the problems with the food industry and our food choices. Humanity has never before needed to change the food system so radically at this scale or speed, but there are solutions to this problem that we can take as individuals in our everyday lives to make a real difference. Let's explore some of those now. The first major one is diet. Fundamentally, large carnivores are actually rare in nature because it takes a lot of prey to support each of them. For every predator on the Serengeti, for instance, there's more than 100 prey animals. There's a large density of herbivores compared to carnivores. By eating meat and eating products like dairy as well, we're demanding huge expanses of space, like we mentioned before. Even low-impact animal products such as eggs, poultry meat, and some farmed fish have a much higher impact than vegetable sources of protein such as soya, legumes, peanuts, or grains. So the single biggest way you can make a difference to not only your personal sustainability, but the sustainability of the food industry is to change your diet. Going plant-based, or primarily plant-based, can offer a real opportunity to do this. As illustrated here by an Oatly chart, plant-based diets will reduce land degradation, land use, and associated impacts. And in this other chart, it will actually decrease consumption slightly as well. Vegans, vegetarians, pescatarians, flexitarians tend to eat a bit less. It will also reduce carbon. So here's another bar chart from the WWF Planet-Based Eating document, where you can see that the supreme downward trend as you go more extreme plant-based diets. The red and the pink on the top there is meat and dairy. So if we cut that from our diets, we can reduce our carbon emissions significantly. And here was a major piece of research done in 2018, which just conceptualizes this further. You can see down the bottom there, tofu, beans, and nuts, which are the main sources of protein for vegans and vegetarians. Even a portion of the highest impact protein here emits less than the lowest impact animal proteins, which are up at the top generally. It's estimated that a global shift to a completely animal-free diet would reduce food-related greenhouse gas emissions by around 49% and farmland by around 76%. That's massive. If we ate a mostly plant-based diet, we would only need 50% of the current farmland. So there's massive potential here to cut the amount of land we're using, therefore the impacts we're putting on the environment, and use it in other ways. The Netherlands is a country that's done this quite extensively, so they do a lot of vertical farming, indoor farming. It's very sustainable, and they've raised yields in the process by 10 times in 2 generations. Like I say, they use less water, pesticides, fertilizer, and less carbon. So another angle we can take as a solution is reducing wastage and improving the processes that are employed. So like we mentioned, composting is the best way to deal with your food waste. So if you can have a home composting kit, that will release less carbon than sending it to anaerobic digestion with the council or your provider. But ultimately, the main thing you can do is act to buy less food and produce less waste in the first place. or learn of ways you can use your veg clippings and other waste items that we think of food waste in different ways. Often you can blend stuff up really easily into things like pastes, pop in things like bolognese. So step one is actually reducing the food you're wasting in the first place. Step two, in terms of wastage, is making sure you're composting and certainly not sending to landfill. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their special report in 2019, said reduction of food loss and waste could lower greenhouse gas emissions and improve food security. Another way you can help with the food industry and becoming more sustainably is shopping organic. So shopping organic means that the products you're buying haven't had fertilizers used or pesticides. It's completely been grown naturally using the power of the earth. So by doing this, you're reducing not only the impacts on that piece of land, you're letting it undergo much more natural processes. You're not changing things like the soils, which can be affected for a long period of time, but also things like pesticides and fertilizers take huge amounts of energy, release huge amounts of carbon to produce. So by shopping organic, you're also cutting the carbon footprint of your diet as well. So look for the organic logos, which I'll put up here for when you're shopping, and try and shop organic. As well as this, shop local. If you buy local, you're reducing associated travel emissions. You're not buying products from either other areas of the UK or other areas of Europe and who knows the world. Start looking for local produce. Over the last year, a lot of places have got local veg box schemes now. So check out things like Riverford for local veg box schemes. If not, when you're in the supermarket, be sure to check where things are from. If you can't restrict to the UK, try and restrict from Europe because there'll be much less carbon implications by buying things from Europe. Ultimately, though, shopping off your back drawer, if there's a farmer down the road, is the best thing. And often what goes in hand with shopping locally is shopping seasonally, which is sustainable for another reason. Similar principles. Often when you shop local, you'll try different products that come into season at different times. So in the more economically developed world that we live in, we're often disconnected from the cycles of farming and what can actually be grown in our country. So if you shop seasonally, you're going to be ditching things that can only be grown in warmer climates in the winter, and you'll be eating vegetables and fruit that can actually be grown in the winter, which is great for sustainability, cuts carbon because you're not importing things from other countries. Often it will mean that land, can be used more naturally because they don't need to alter it in some way to try and grow things that don't usually grow in that season. And also expands your culinary tastes and skills, which is really sustainable for the future, where we're likely to have to adapt to this more plant-based living and make you more resourceful in the long run. Also, what you can do to take things to the next level is trying to shop plastic-free or zero waste. So shopping plastic-free alleviates the problems associated with plastic packaging. As we talked about, that can vary from actual physical pollution and harm to animals, right down to microplastics, ingesting them and eating them, which is terrible. So try and shop plastic-free. A lot of the time now, there will be a local plastic-free or zero-waste shop near you, so have a look out for that. If you don't have a designated shop, try taking your own containers to places like your local farm shop. Shopping zero waste or plastic-free not only alleviates the problems associated with harm to animals and the environment, but also plastic and packaging is very carbon intensive. So cutting that from your lifestyle will reduce carbon significantly. And often things like paper products or alternatives like vegware are grown using resources still. So it will reduce the need to grow those resources, use the land in the first place, which may have been treated in certain ways with fertilizers, pesticides, things like that. So we're reducing the environmental impact on that side as well. Above all, though, ultimately, purchasing power is so powerful. We mustn't underestimate our impact we can have just through simply living our lives the way we want to and purchasing the goods and service that we want to that mirror our morals and values. So I'm going to leave you with a few quotes here to emphasize that point. So the first one is from Anna Lapp, who is a sustainable food advocate, author and educator. Every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. It's so true. Whether you put your money into a dairy-free product, a meat-free product, or an organic product, a local product from the local veg store rather than a supermarket chain, a plastic-free product from a zero-waste store rather than a plastic package option, or a non-plastic version of the same product that a company is selling, you're casting a vote for what you want that company to produce, or small business to produce. So every time you spend your pennies, it's showing businesses and producers what the demand is. So if we flux that demand, if we change that demand regionally, locally, and then nationally, it'll have global implications. It will drive agricultural system change. It will drive change in the food industry to mirror that of what the consumer's demanding. So really don't underestimate your impact you can have simply from spending money on what you want. It's often not what is on the shelves that the companies look at, it's what's off the shelf. So if we buy lots of the things that are better for the environment, that are better considering food and sustainability, we will drive processes that are more environmentally friendly and better in terms of sustainability. The other great one here is from Cristiana Figueres, who was the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She headed up the Paris Agreement in 2015. What makes you feel better quickly is actually to engage in a positive contribution so that you bust through this myth that individual actions don't count. You begin to realize the world is only made out of individual actions. It does count. It does add up. This is beautiful because an organization, a university, a family, a business, a country, the world is simply the sum of individual actions and individual choices. Culture is driven by individual choices and influence. Therefore, change really can happen if you make individual differences to your life. So I hope this video has been really useful in showing you some of the solutions you can employ to address sustainability challenges that food and the food industry poses. Do check out the other stuff going on as part of Feastival. Feel free to contact me either on LinkedIn or by email if you have further questions. And enjoy the rest of your day, and do think about sustainability next time you think of food. Thank you.